policy was used to address the worst economic catastrophe in U.S. history. This occurred during the 1930s. It became a major idea amongst Americans during the 1920s, and the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, helped along with that idea. The Great Depression occurred during this, and that was considered the worst economic catastrophe in U.S. history. It occurred in October 1929 due to a crash in the stock market, and no matter what social class you were, this affected you heavily. The unemployment rate went up from about 13% to about 25% because of this stock in the crash market. There's many different ideas based off of this, and some theorists contend that the nation's economic expansion was halted because industry and affluent persons had insufficient capital at their disposal. And then there's other theorists that argue that the Great Depression occurred because the majority of American consumers lacked sufficient resources to purchase consumer goods. So there's lots of back and forth that go on about this certain topic. When it comes to the social policy, some Americans found this to be an intriguing concept, whereas some social reformers weren't too thrilled about the idea during the 1920s, and part of that reasoning was because it had to do with the communists, traitors, and radicals that were being stigmatized as. The period of denial occurred from 1929 to 1933, and this affected everyone, including the president, Herbert Hoover. He became more conservative during this time because of the nation's move toward following more liberal ideas, but they did, however, start to lose some trust in him around 1930. He had pressure from Congress to help local governments finally lead to passage of the Emergency Relief and Construction Act in 1932. And even though Hoover had won a sweeping victory in 1928, the Republican Party suffered such extensive losses in the congressional election of 1930 that its majority was reduced to a narrow margin, hence why so many people started losing faith in him. We then had our next president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was elected in November 1932. He knew that they could no longer have a policy drift because of the banking system, and now, instead of about 25% of being unemployed, it was 20% to 60% that were unemployed, and this resulted in the children no longer being supported by their parents because of this rate. Franklin Roosevelt realized that he was not going to be able to follow what Hoover did because otherwise the Great Depression will continue to expand and get much worse rather than ending altogether. This led to the New Deal victories and Social Security Act. The New Deal reached success in 1935 and 1936, even with the conservative pressure that was being put on Roosevelt. The Social Security Act is the foundation of the American welfare and is there to help address different social problems. Oppression of vulnerable population in the New Deal was a very common thing amongst women, African Americans, Latinos, just anybody that wasn't a white male dealt with these. And that is why they focused most of their attention on the unemployment and relief. However, that was when all of these people weren't sure if their needs were going to be treated the same and spoken about in the New Deal. The reforms that Franklin D. Roosevelt had were tempered by conservative forces in the context in which he worked. The actual reforms that were enacted in 1933 and 1934 can be understood only in the context of this set of contradictory forces.